such an expert, or have you got a condition? I mean, people don't normally eat that much, do they?
Oh, Burger is my middle name.
What's your first name? Cheese?
The protagonist and human embodiment of the eponymous Ultraman is Jack Shindo, played by Dor Kraus. Not much is ever specified of his backstory, other than the fact that he was a Yuma member that was deployed on a research mission to Mars with his friend Stanley, where they were intercepted by Gudis. His superhero alter ego grants him some other feats that he can use while still in his human form, such as knowledge on how the Gudis-infected creatures operate, physically and mentally, and he can communicate with other alien species, such as Bios in the previously mentioned scene in Episode 9. And fun fact, his name, Jack Shindo, was actually inspired from two former characters in the Ultra series. Shindo derived from Shin Hayata, who served as the human host of the first Ultraman, while Jack came from the name that was given to the 1971 Ultraman. For years, the eponymous alien in that show was simply referred to as New Ultraman, as I already specified. But in 1984, due to licensing issues, the character was renamed Ultraman Jack, after Tsuburaya and Bandai held a contest for children, in which the winning child selected the character's new name. Outside his alien persona, he's sometimes very sensitive on certain matters that he doesn't approve of. In a couple of instances, he was hesitant about the idea of killing the featured Gudis creatures. Barring his extra senses, he can instantly gather which mutations are able to fight off their Gudis control, and which ones are too far gone to approach reasonably. To him, it felt like murder to attack and destroy the creatures that had no control of their bodily functions, or were merely frightened by the alien inhibitors in their system. During one of these scenarios, he expressed partial regret to Ultraman about the idea of saving the world not as a human, but through the otherworldly fusion with the titular Ultra hero.
I want to fight, but I want to be human.
Well, you are most of the time.
Sometimes I feel I have more in common with that Gigasaurus than my own kind.
It's a level of depth that was never displayed in any previous installments, which I thought was actually kind of a nice touch for the series. Even more, I admired how the writer treated the symbiotic relationship between Jack and Ultraman, as the latter seemed to serve as the voice of reason and comfort for Jack in times of need, kind of like what Obi-Wan Kenobi was to Luke Skywalker. It really seemed like a novel concept for the franchise, to have an entry that not only emphasizes the fact that the Ultra and his human host are two separate characters, but they can also communicate with one another, in which the alien half would serve almost like a moral compass for the human protagonist. This idea was repeated in Episode 6, where Jack was fearing for the life of Jean Echo, one of the Yuma team recruits, after she became infected by Gudis, where Ultraman urged Jack to understand that Jean's willpower was much stronger than he understood. In connection with the current narrative, Jack is very conscious on the state and protection of the Earth and its natural surroundings. This was even more evident in Episodes 12 and 13, when he expressed formal disapproval of the idea of mankind fixing the ozone layer by its own hands. But we already discussed how much I hated that plot thread. I still like him as a hero, though, as he's always intent on doing whatever means necessary to keep his team and the lives of civilians in safe hands. While he was initially against Yuma's attempts to kill Bogan and Gigasaurus, knowing they weren't in full control of themselves, he was not hesitant about finding other procedures to aid Yuma in exploring an alternative route to slowing and apprehending the threat. When those plans failed, he was quick to change into Ultraman to destroy the monster without hesitation, to prevent any further damage from occurring. One scene I really liked was when he mocked Gudis for failing to notice a dilemma in his plans to take over the Earth. This was an attempt by Jack to enrage Gudis to the point he would lose focus during his bout with Ultraman, allowing the latter to summon the opportunity to strike Gudis with his guard down. It might be against the honorable code of ethics, but when the hero's in a weakened state, I've just always loved the idea of him openly and nonchalantly taunting the villain before taking him by surprise. It kinda gives me goosebumps sometimes. Though, in regards to the writing, one of the earliest complaints I have towards Jack was within the first few minutes of the first episode. After Ultraman swoops in to battle Gudis on Mars, in an attempt to save the two astronauts, Jack is suddenly trapped by some falling debris. Stanley tries in vain to free him, before Jack puts a gun to Stan's face, urging him to head to the ship and save himself. Wow, right? But then, just a few seconds later, Jack uses the blaster to blow away the rocks, thus freeing him from his entrapment. Why he didn't just do that in the first place before threatening to shoot his friend will leave me indefinitely perplexed. Especially when we later see Gudis destroy the space shuttle while Stan was still inside. So you could say Jack basically, albeit indirectly, sent his friend to his death.
You're joking.
Which is even worse when we later learn that Stan is resurrected on Earth by the powers of the Gudis mutagenic strain, who continually makes matters worse for Yuma in episodes 2 and 5, resulting in the deaths of who knows how many people. To be fair though, if he had freed himself earlier, both he and Stan probably would have fled to the ship just as Gudis attacked it before it could launch, killing both men and leaving Ultraman without a human host to survive on Earth to battle the mutant Gudis parasites that followed. So, okay, fair enough on that point. But even so, it really bothers me that he didn't just fire a blast on the boulders to free himself while Stan was still beside him. Wouldn't that have been a lot more sensible than putting the gun barrel right in his friend's face, just because he was trying to rescue him? Next is Jean Echo, played by Gia Carides, who some of you might actually remember from her later performance in Austin Powers 2. While the original Ultraman had Akiko Fuji, who was a mostly one-dimensional character, Jean is probably the most hardcore member of Yuma. No matter the danger, Jean always runs headstrong into the battlefield to fight off the invader, even if it puts her own life at risk, which nearly happened at least once. And I'm serious when I say she's hardcore, as she often has an attitude problem when it comes to solving a mystery, and will even punch federal agents across the face if they get in her way.
You'll only make a mess of things.
Yes, but it'll be our mess, won't it, Miss Echo? Echo, 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 Echo.
She's probably also the only actor in the entire Ultraman franchise to ever say the word bullshit.
The choice is yours. Gudis is a god.
That's not a choice. That's bullshit.
Which is a little weird for what's supposed to be a kids' show. Then again, this is the same franchise that once featured an episode where a woman is kidnapped by a psycho who's in love with her, and if she didn't love him back, he'd lock her in a dark room till she dies, like the last woman he abducted. This fighting spirit of hers nearly got Jean killed, as I said previously. When Jack was having a standoff with the Gudis-infected Stanley, Jean became contaminated by the Gudis virus. The monster struggled to take control of her mind, but Jean was strong enough to keep it in check on occasions. She wasn't entirely successful at that, as Gudis continually managed to surpass her willpower. But through the aid of Jack, she was able to keep the alien strain under wraps just long enough for it to completely vacate her mind, following Gudis' defeat by Ultraman. And if you think that's a series spoiler this early in the review, it's not. You'll see why in a bit. The team leader of Yuma is Arthur Grant, played by Ralph Cotterill. He's your typical, serious, no-nonsense captain that's always quick to call someone out on their juvenile or careless actions, regardless of how the other party feels about it. So much so that he'll even disobey orders from the higher-ups in order to take care of the incoming threat, sometimes while maintaining a snide smirk and demeanor throughout the experience. This became more evident in Episode 6, when Lieutenant Brewer attempted to overthrow the operations of Yuma when Gudis was pooling his energy to emerge in his final form. When I first watched the series, Arthur's serious persona reminded me a lot of Captain Muramatsu from the original Ultraman. That became more interesting when I learned that, when the series aired in Japan, Ralph Cotterill's voice was dubbed by Akichi Kobayashi, the same actor who played Captain Muramatsu.
南西太平洋上に何かが大量に降り注ぐのが観測された。現在判明していることは、我々の地球が危険にさらされているということだ。すげえぞこだ。こりゃ細胞か。
我々を助けようとしているんじゃ。
Next is Kim Xiaomin, played by Grace Parr, who I think is actually my favorite new character of the series. Her personality is almost like a genetic fusion between Jack, Jean, and Arthur, in that she can be temperamental while on the playing field, but she also has a soft side for people and the environment, She'll even go so far as to refrain from following orders from her superiors if she thinks the situation at hand is too dangerous to approach, or too extreme to avoid, even if she literally has to tell them to stuff it to get her point across. At times, she's actually very crafty while following a mission. In Episode 7, she lost her weapon and communication device while outrunning the monster Gazebo. In the process, she discovered a patch of these strange mushrooms that, when struck with heavy force, they expel a barrage of spores that proved powerful enough to repel the monster. Unfortunately, she realized too late that these mushrooms also eat away through any type of metal, which included her weapon and her communicator. With no other weapons at hand or a means to contact her team, she settled on gathering the mushrooms and lathering them in mud to temporarily hold their ignition, allowing her to carry a small cluster of them with her to fend off Gazebo while she ventured her way out of the forest. The next member is Lloyd Wilder, played by Rick Adams. Outside maybe one or two moments of being somewhat of a comic relief character, the one thing that probably sets him apart from the others is that he's somewhat skeptical and hot-tempered when he's out on a mission. Kind of like Arashi from the original Ultraman.
Do I have to take Shindo?
Yes. He's got a nose for trouble.
The guy's a fruitcake. He's from another planet. Nobody could dress like he does and call himself civilized.
Well, maybe you can help him while you're traveling with him tomorrow.
You'll have to make that an order.
The last member of Yuma is Charles Morgan, played by Lloyd Morris, who's the team's technical expert, and the real comic relief character of the main cast. Anyone who's a fan of the original Ultraman will immediately relate him to E-Day, as both characters are geniuses who come up with most of the team's inventions, and also stand out as the team's plucky stooge. Though the writer at least had the good sense to tone down Charles' silly antics compared to E-Day's much more slapstick style. And I think this is what puts him ahead of Lloyd, as his humor is more consistent. Charles' best recurring gag is that he loves to eat. No matter the team dilemma or cataclysmic crisis at hand, Charles always finds time and an excuse to grab a snack, or complain that he's too hungry to do anything else.
Well, what have you found?
No!
Charles, have you got something to tell me about this plant?
Come on, Charles. The world's waiting on you.
Haven't even had breakfast yet. And how do we dispatch this grasshopper?
You mean kill it?
Yes.
Oh, I'm a lover, not a fighter. It's not my department.
Think again.
When a monster becomes too much for Yuma to tangle with, Jack Shindo pulls out his Delta Plasma Pendant, manifesting his body into the form of the eponymous Ultraman Great. Well, eponymous when it comes to the Japanese release, anyway. Hailing from Nebula M78, this Ultraman jumped from one corner of the galaxy to the other, tracking down and doing battle with the malevolent Gudis, which reportedly was so evil, so powerful, that it not only threatened M78, but also the entirety of every planet in existence. Their deadly struggle eventually led them to Mars, before finally reaching Earth for one final deathly battle for the stability, or the takeover, of the universe. Unfortunately for Ultraman, on Earth, Gudis has a slight advantage over the humanoid Titan. Being exposed to the pollution in Earth's atmosphere, Ultraman can only remain in his giant form for a mere 3 minutes, which is calculated by the color timer on his torso. Any longer, his energy will be exhausted and he'll die, likely taking Jack's life with him. Lucky for him, he's been fitted with a large variety of powers and skills that he can use to aid him in his combat with the opposing monsters he encounters. As he's an extraterrestrial being, he can thrive in the vacuum of space, he can fly at tremendous speeds, and aside from his immense stamina, he can fire an array of different beams, all ranging in strength, that can deal extreme damage against his foes. My favorite weapon of his is a pair of beam swords that he can extend out of his fist to slice through an enemy like a lightsaber. Should his own attacks prove ineffective, he can literally capture the projectile of his enemy, concentrate its power, and then fire it back at the monster with enhanced force. Why this Ultra's energy is vulnerable only to the pollution in Earth's atmosphere, as opposed to weaker solar energy like the past Ultramen, is never explained in the series. If our air was clean from any such pathogens and toxins, does that mean he would be able to retain his gigantic form for an indefinite period? That would be pretty cool, but from a fan perspective, that'd make the hero too overpowering, which was one reason why Eiji Tsuburaya came up with the idea of the color timer in the first place, so that the character should have at least one major weakness to keep him from appearing nearly invincible. At least in the Japanese version, they retained the concept that he just needs a stronger access to solar radiation in order to remain in his gigantic form, as opposed to the aforementioned polluted atmosphere concept. And while we're on the subject, just how powerful is great compared to other Ultramen? Well, that question was partially answered in the final episode. Ultraman's final foe in the series is Shillagi. After a few minutes of a decisive struggle, Ultraman pulls out his beam swords to slice through the monster, before delivering one final beam blast, knocking Shillagi to the ground. I'm calling this into question because much earlier, Yuma tried to destroy Shillagi by hitting him with a nuclear bomb in space, which didn't even leave a scratch on the beast. And yet, when Ultraman shows up, it only takes 2 or 3 direct blasts to bring down the big bird.
Whatever the general just did, he was wrong.
Now, after witnessing this, I've reached 3 possible conclusions about how this ending came to pass the way it did. 1, it's a plot hole that the writer overlooked, creating a typical contrived plot convenience for the hero. 2, Shillagi may have been at least partially weakened by the nuclear explosion and the radioactivity it carried, thus giving Ultraman a fighting chance. Or 3, maybe Shillagi was at full strength, making this victory serve as an example of just how powerful Ultraman Great really is, seeing as how he was able to fulfill what a nuclear missile failed to accomplish. You be the judge.
Are you okay?
My lunch exploded. Must have been too much vinegar in the dressing.
Cancel the Air Force. Send in a shredder. Oh, and get your feet off my desk.